1 Samuel 15 and 16 describe the fall of King Saul and the rise of King David. Both of these men were anointed to be kings of Israel by the prophet Samuel. So these two chapters are back to back, so we can see this contrast between these two men, both chosen of God, and how each of them responded to God's call. Now, Saul had already been king for some time, and in the process, God had asked Saul through the prophet Samuel to protect the land of Israel. It's the land of inheritance for the people. And so God gave Saul what to us might seem like a very difficult command, which was to clean out the land, to remove all the people and the animals in certain cities that were in the land that was promised to the Israelites. We might call this total warfare, like a total annihilation. It turns out in one of these instances in chapter 15, Saul did not actually fully obey God's command. He held back some of the spoil or the plunder or the resources. He didn't execute everybody in the city that he was asked to execute, including the king of a particular city. What happens is a conversation between Saul and Samuel, where it's very clear to Samuel, the prophet, that Saul is actually out for himself and not for the cause of God. And let's look at a couple of verses in particular that make this case that Saul, even though he'd been anointed, he did not do as God commanded. He did according to his own heart's desire. And that his heart did not always line up with God's heart. And we see that when David was called, that God called him in part because David's heart was pure and aligned with God's. Let's take a look at 1 Samuel 15, verse 12. And when Samuel rose early to meet Saul in the morning, and this is after this big battle had happened where Saul was supposed to conquer everything in the city, it was told Samuel, saying, Saul came to Carmel, and behold, he set him up a place, and has gone about and passed on and gone down to Gilgal. Now we read this and we think, oh, well, Samuel and Saul were supposed to meet, and Saul's off doing other things. At first blush, that seems pretty innocent. It turns out this phrase, he set him up a place, is actually better translated from the Hebrew, he set himself up a monument. He made himself great. Instead of having God make him great, Saul assumed that he was great, and so he wanted to set up a monument to himself. He wanted his name to be on some big monument so people will think that he was great and awesome. And this is the first challenge, that Saul was doing these things for his own name glory and not for the glory of God. He was seeking to do things so that people would think he was great. He was trying to make his nation great by his own will and for his own purposes and not for God's. Very problematic. So if you continue on, if you look at verses 13, 20, and 24, this conversation where Samuel is trying to get to the heart of the matter, to find out where is Saul's heart. Is Saul for himself and his own glory, which is a terrible thing for any leader or politician to do, or are they actually only doing what God has asked them to do and being strictly obedient to God's commands to build God's kingdom and not to build their own name or their own kingdom? Listen to some of these things. Verse 13, when Samuel finally finds Saul, he says to Samuel, "Blessed be thou of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." He didn't. Saul is now lying. He was not 100% faithful to the command of the Lord. This is a problem. Let's turn to verse 20. Saul said unto Samuel, "I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord has sent me, and have brought Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites." It's like, wait a second, Saul, you're not getting the message. You were supposed to be 100% obedient, and you weren't, and you're still claiming you did what you should when you didn't. Verse 24, Saul says unto Samuel, "I have sinned, for I have transgressed the commandments of the Lord and thy words, because I feared the people and I obeyed their voice." How is this making the situation any better for Saul? So instead of Saul simply acknowledging in humility, Samuel, you're right. I didn't fully obey God's commands. I did 75% or 85%, even 95% or 99%, but this 1% I did on my own because I thought God was wrong and I wanted to do it my own way. And when Saul finally acknowledges that he has sinned, that he has not kept God's commands, what does he do? He blames it on the people. No good leader, no righteous leader ever blames their actions on other people. A righteous leader always takes full responsibility for what they've done. In fact, more importantly, if you take coaches, American football coaches, it's very interesting listening to post-game interviews. Most good coaches take the responsibility when things don't go well and say, I need to work better to coach my team on this. And when things have gone well, they give the honor and glory to their team. That's what good leaders do. They don't take the honor and glory for other people's good work. And when things don't go well, particularly if they were the cause of the problem, they always acknowledge that as a leader, that they could be better, that they could be working harder. Good, righteous leaders do this. Saul doesn't. And for this and other reasons, he gets deposed as a leader. If you turn to chapter 16, God's now on the lookout, working through Samuel to find a new king. And let's turn to verse 7. Now, Samuel's gone to this family, and he goes to the family of David's family, and he notices that David is probably like the last one that he would be choosing. So Samuel visually thought, oh, well, I'm definitely going to choose one of David's older brothers. But here's what God said instead. Verse 7, the Lord said unto Samuel, look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. Speaking about David's older brother, who, from a physical standpoint, looks like he should be the next king. God goes on and says in verse 7 of 1 Samuel 16, for the Lord seeth not as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. So God knew that he could trust David's heart. And we know that later on, David committed some pretty grievous mistakes, and yet still found himself turning back to God, acknowledging his errors, and aligning himself fully with God's commands. So what can we take away from this? First, God will choose his leaders. And any leader who tries to make their name great or make themselves great or to blame their actions on other people or say they take their marching orders from the people they're supposed to be leading, those are not actually leaders that we should follow or that are chosen of God. Second, we learn that God chooses people who are fully aligned to his commands and after his own heart. I look at our modern day church leaders in the General Relief Society presidency, in the First Presidency, and the prophets. These are people who have their hearts aligned 100% to God's work. They have been chosen for this time to do his work. Now, how does this matter to all of us? We are all chosen to be here on this earth right now, and we can choose to be like David, aligning our hearts, our actions, our dreams, our desires to what God wants. Instead of being like Saul, where we're simply and only pursuing our own desires, our own dreams, and only simply trying to make our name great at the expense of doing what God has commanded.